Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. We have some breaking news at UFC 283 in Brazil. We are getting Deiveson Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno for the flyweight title, and this is a title unification bout. Figueiredo is the undisputed flyweight champion. Moreno is the interim flyweight champion. And these are two guys that's fought each other 3 times before in a relatively short period of time. And there was some wonder for a while whether or not these guys were going to fight each other again. And I'm super hyped that this fight has finally been made. I'm going to give you my reaction. I'm going to give you my early prediction. And also, I thought there was some interesting wording in this report about Figueiredo versus Moreno, which we're going to get in towards the end of the video. But first off, I am pumped for this fight. There is some people who have been talking, for the last 6 or so months, really, since January, that they said, you know what, we don't want to see Deiveson Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno for. We've already saw it 3 times. We want some new contenders, some fresh meat. People saying Kai Kara France should be fighting Figueiredo. And then there was Deiveson Figueiredo saying, I'm not fighting Brandon Moreno again. And I don't really understand that. All 3 fights were amazing. We're going to briefly talk about each one here in a second. And the third fight, I believe, was inconclusive about who was the better fighter. So they're 2 elite level fighters. They're now both either champion or former champion. I thought it should have been made before the Kai Kara France fight. The UFC needed to add another title fight to UFC 277. We're going to talk about that fight in a second as well. And, Figueiredo was threatening the UFC, saying, I'm going to move up to bantamweight, which really made no sense to me. And we'll talk about that as well. There's so much to talk about when it comes to this fight. But either way, we're finally getting this fight. The undisputed champion in Figueiredo versus the interim flyweight champion in Brandon Moreno in the first ever quadrilogy in the UFC, and definitely the first ever quadrilogy for a UFC title in UFC history. So this is a historic fight. This has never happened before. And, just thinking about this and how excited I am for this fight, it's crazy. And this makes me hate TJ Dillashaw even more. TJ Dillashaw attempted to go down to the flyweight division using EPO, injecting it into his ass cheeks, and tried to shut down the division. That was the narrative going into that fight. TJ said, I'm going to go down and I'm going to shut down the division, because essentially what he was planning on doing is dethroning Henry Cejudo and then basically vacating the belt, effectively destroying the division. And the UFC's kind of been iffy on the flyweight division forever because for some reason fans just don't like the smaller guys. I'm so glad that didn't happen. I mean, I can't imagine a world where we got the women's featherweight division, which is essentially non-existent. The women's bantamweight division, leaves a lot to be desired. There's a bunch of divisions that are absolutely terrible. The flyweight division is looking so good right now. In his last fight, Brandon Moreno was able to get the interim lightweight title. He fought Kai Kara France at UFC 277. Kai Kara France was the most deserving flyweight contender. There was talk of even giving Kai Kara France a shot against Deiveson Figueiredo before this interim title fight came to fruition. And this was a great fight. This was a competitive fight. Brandon Moreno eventually gets the 3rd round TKO. Finished him off with a nasty body kick. And Kai Kara France is an elite level fighter that's always getting better. And, I would have been fine with them making the 4th fight between Figueiredo versus Moreno without this Kai Kara France fight. But now it makes it even more compelling because Brandon Moreno goes out there against a known elite flyweight fighter and looks like an absolute killer, finishes him off with a nasty body kick. And now I believe there's more hype coming into this fight. For Deiveson Figueiredo, his last 3 fights were against Brandon Moreno. His last fight was in January of this year at UFC 270. So he won't fight, for a year. By the time this fight comes around, it'll almost be exactly a year to the date they last fought since Deiveson Figueiredo's last fight. It was at UFC 270, and this was a very close fight. I watched this fight a couple times. I know some people thought Brandon Moreno got robbed. I thought Brandon Moreno won the fight initially, but I thought it was very close. And when I went back and rewatched the fight, I thought the only definitive round was round 2 for Brandon Moreno. The rest of the rounds were literally toss-ups. You could have gave it 5-0 for Brandon Moreno. I know that sounds crazy. You could have gave it 4-1 to Deiveson Figueiredo. That's how close this fight was. They were so evenly matched, and it was an amazing fight. It was a high-level fight. Every aspect of MMA was in this fight. And I know, there's so many people that said, I don't want to see this again. I've seen it 3 times. I don't want to see it again. How can you not want to see this fight again? Just knowing the story. I mean, this is an amazing storyline here between Figueiredo and Moreno. The second fight happened at UFC 263, June of last year. And this was the craziest fight of the 3, in my opinion, because Brandon Moreno went out there and basically steamrolled him. I mean, that's a hair of an exaggeration, but Brandon Moreno went out there and made Deiveson Figueiredo look like he didn't even belong in there, and eventually finishes him with a rear naked choke in the 3rd round and outclassed him for the entire fight before that on the feet. There was some talk that Figueiredo was sick, that he had a bad weight cut, and that's why we had the trilogy. Because a lot of people after the second fight were saying we don't really need to see a 3rd fight after what Brandon Moreno did in the second fight. And it's just such an interesting story. And then you have Figueiredo coming back in that 3rd fight and being able to win after getting dominated in the second fight. That's so interesting. Then you have the first fight, which is even more bizarre circumstances because that was at UFC 255 or 256. But a couple weeks prior, 3 weeks prior at UFC 255, both guys fought on the same card against different opponents. You had Deiveson Figueiredo, who defended his belt against Alex Perez, and then you had Brandon Moreno, who beat Brandon Royval. And the UFC needed a pay-per-view headliner for UFC 256 3 weeks later, and they offered Brandon Moreno a title shot. So they fought each other on literally 3 weeks' notice. It was a very close fight. I thought that Deiveson Figueiredo won the first fight if it wasn't for the point deduction. There was a point deduction. I think Figueiredo hit him in the groin, or I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a point taken from Deiveson Figueiredo, and then it ended up being a draw, which I thought made perfect sense. And the fight was amazing. I mean, this was a back and forth fight, one of the best fights I've seen in 2020. And I was very happy that they ran it back because it was so close. And you have to take into account both guys took that fight on 3 weeks' notice. I know a lot of people will say, oh, fighters are fighters. They should always be ready. For me, what I love about this sport is seeing 2 elite level guys on a full camp, 100% healthy, even though that's very rare, going out there and trying their best. I don't like to have these asterisks next to it. Imagine Brandon Moreno went out there and starched Figueiredo the first time and maybe they never fought again. It would have been like, well, was that the real Deiveson Figueiredo? Because he didn't have a full camp. He had 3 weeks notice. So I'm super pumped for this 4th fight. I think it makes perfect sense. I think it's the only fight to make right now, even though we're going to talk about him in a second. You got a contender blazing up in the flyweight division who I can't wait to see the winner fight this, see the winner of this fight him. I mean, it's a super compelling fight. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you're one of the people out there complaining about Deiveson Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno 4, I can't help you. Go see a psychiatrist. They had 3 fights. 2 of them were absolutely amazing. And one of them was a world-class performance by Brandon Moreno. And now the guy that put on the world-class performance and has the most dominant win of the 3 fights doesn't have the belt. So it's super interesting. They're 1-1-1. How can you not make a 4th fight? I mean, these are the same people clamoring for Max Holloway to get a trilogy fight, even though he lost the first 2 fights, saying, oh, these guys are 1-1-1. I want to see some fresh meat in the division. But I'm super pumped for this. I can't wait for UFC 283 in Brazil. I think this makes perfect sense. Deiveson Figueiredo being Brazilian, I think, this is a great fight to return to Brazil. And, looking back at UFC 277, Brandon Moreno versus Kai Kara France, that was my favorite fight on the card. And depending on how this card plays out, which also I'm going to talk about in a second, I think this may be my favorite fight on the card. Obviously, we'll have to see how it plays out. And, I thought it was really weird that Deiveson Figueiredo was kind of saying, I don't want to fight Brandon Moreno again. And I just found it very strange because of how close the trilogy fight was. And for me, it was almost like Brandon Moreno might have my number. In a way, I don't want to fight him again. I very rarely say one professional fighter is ducking another. But the way Figgy was just, he was going crazy trying not to fight Brandon Moreno for a 4th time. It just seemed like he was trying to duck him. And I guess after the last 2 fights or last 3 fights, I don't blame him, even though he won at UFC 270. But I thought that was weird. And also he was going to say he's going to go up to bantamweight. I'm telling you guys right now, and I'm going to get to my early prediction here in a minute. if Deiveson Figueiredo, I love Deiveson Figueiredo's skill set. He's an elite level fighter. If he moves up to bantamweight, he will get slaughtered. That is the best division in the UFC. So, I think it makes sense for him to stay at flyweight. As far as an early prediction for this fight, I am going with Brandon Moreno. I'm not sure the method of victory yet. I might go with Brandon Moreno, by decision. These guys know each other so well. But for me, I think Brandon Moreno won the third fight, even though it was very close and could have went either way. I think Figueiredo, made great adjustments coming into that third fight. He was really chopping the legs of Brandon Moreno, which helped negate some of the pressure of Brandon Moreno because he didn't want to be heavy on that lead leg, and it was hard for him to pressure Figgy, which is where he has the most success. And then also you have the power of Figgy being thrown back as well. And then also Figueiredo was getting out wrestled in the second fight. He's working with Henry Cejudo. He's working on his wrestling. His wrestling looked much better in the third fight as well. But I'm looking at their age. As they get up there in age in the lower weight divisions, it usually doesn't end well. And Deiveson Figueiredo is 34 years old. Meanwhile, you have Brandon Moreno, who is 28 years old currently. So there's an age gap there. I think Brandon Moreno is very durable. I don't see Figgy putting him out. I think Brandon Moreno is going to come out in this fourth fight. He's going to make a lot of adjustments. I think he's going to be more motivated than ever. And I think he's going to come out against Deiveson Figueiredo. And I think he's going to get the belt back. For the love of God, I hope and pray there's no weird controversial decision or draw, because a fifth fight, I don't think the UFC would do that. So let's hope we get some finality to this quadrilogy at UFC 283. The one interesting thing I wanted to point out, when this report came out that this fight was going down at UFC 283, there was two key words missing from this report, and that was whether or not it was the main event. Usually when these fights get announced or reported, people say this is the main event of UFC 283 or this is the co-main event. This has not been reported. So I believe, and I made a video about Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington. I'll link it down in the description. I'll get to what I'm talking about in 1 second. But I believe what's going to happen is, it's been rumored for a while that Yuri Prochazka versus Glover Teixeira 2 will take place in December at UFC 282. I believe that fight will be moved to UFC 283, and I believe the headliner of UFC 283 in Brazil will be Yuri Prochazka defending his light heavyweight title against Glover Teixeira in Brazil. The co-main event, Deiveson Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno for the flyweight title, and I don't care what else is on the card at that point. That's an amazing card. And then I believe the main event of UFC 282 in December will be Khamzat Chimaev versus Colby Covington. That's what I believe. I hope it happens. Those sound like great cards. I'm sure there's plenty of other Brazilian fighters they could throw on UFC 283, but they have not been to Brazil, I think, since 2019. So I think the UFC is going to want to make a big entrance back into that Brazilian market, and that's why I believe, even though it's been reported for a while that Prochazka versus Teixeira is going to happen in December in Las Vegas at UFC 282, I believe they're moving that to the January card, and that will be the main event of the January card, UFC 283. Let me know what you guys think of all this. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.